Good morning, friends. I have some fun little tips for creating loose watercolors. I know that's a huge challenge for most beginner watercolor students and maybe even more advanced. I wanted to just help you out a little bit and share some things that I do. I do them so automatically now. I really had to go back and sit down and think about what I am doing. So I've got 3 different techniques here, and you can kind of decide which seems to work best for you. And, mostly just have fun with wet and wet or loose florals. It's always best to allow the happy accidents, have as least amount of details and going in there and touching and tidying up as possible. You want to have plenty of water. You just want it to feel like this beautiful, effortless charm, right? They're soft, they're flowy, and full of those happy little accidents. And not to worry. So here's just a couple simple ways that I do that. This is the first way. And by the way, I'm using my Paul Rubens My Lang palette. This is the student grade, fantastic. It's like $20, I think, or 20 some dollars. They're beautiful. You can use another great palette here would be that Paul Rubens Professional, which just means it has a higher light fastness. Their floral palette I don't have sitting right here right now, but it's a beautiful little palette as well. I'm using my number 8 round. It's quite snappy. The Paul Rubens version of that would be that beautiful handle velvet touch that's nice and soft, both short handled. And that'll be part of one of the little tips I give you too. I tend to work with a short handle. I just like it. When I work with a long one, I tend to knock everything around me. I tend to work close to my paper, so I will hit things with it. So my brush isn't available anymore, but I will link down below that Princeton Velvet Touch for you. And then I've got, this is the Meeden block, 140 pound cold press. And I love it for working wet and wet, but you can absolutely use those beautiful Artisto pads if you're in the US. All right, let's get going with the first tip I have. The first tip is to use start with your water. Now you have to work a little quick because if you wait too long, it's going to dry. And then when you put your paint in there, it's not going to spread so well. What I'm going to do, and let me just do a simple little drawing because maybe you may need to do this. If your flower is right here, so I'm just drawing in my flower. I'm going to give myself an idea of where I want the petals. So typically a 5 petal, I may be going to want, let me see if I can use my pen so you can see it. Now this is going to kind of funky up my loose watercolor because you're going to see my lines, but I'm doing this so you can get an idea. So there's one petal maybe I'll have coming out there, maybe one here, maybe here, 4 and 5. Now, I don't use those guidelines all the time, especially if I'm trying to go really washy, flowy, and wet. But what I'm going to do is take my brush, load it with some water, tap, tap, tap. But I actually want to keep quite a bit of water on my brush. And then I'm going to go in and create my brush strokes first, just with water. So I'll go in here, there we go. Oops, that's the Micron pen. Not sure why it's kind of picking up and blurring. I typically use my Ohuhu markers. So while this is still wet, I really want this to be loaded with water. I'm laying down my shapes. Now I'm gonna go in with my paint. So 50-50 here, tap, tap, tap. And now I go in and I lay in my paint and look at this washy effect I get. Leaving some white space. White space is always really important if you're trying to go loose and flowy and organic. So I'm just leaving that just as it is. This is what it will look like when it dries. So I'm going to let that kind of dry, and look at all the beautiful white space. I'm just basically letting the water do its thing here. And then the next one, while we wait for that to dry, and actually another little tip is for creating that washiness and that lightness and that organic feel, add in your stem while this is still wet. So you want to have those bleeds. You want to have those blending. And then point press down, point press down. There you go. And I could have done that with water first as well, for sure. And always, less is more. So I'm going back into it right now, but really try to do as least amount of brush strokes as possible. We'll come back to this. Let's let that kind of sit and dry. You can even soften with a wet brush some of those little edges, but I think that looks fine. Let's go to our second flower here. So this one, I don't paint like this too often, but it does help you kind of lose that control. I tend to hold my brush up in here. It just gives me a lot more control with the angles and the pressure. If you want to really practice getting more loose, hold your brush back a little bit farther and just let your brush kind of wiggle and dance on your paper. And again, give yourself, maybe a 3-minute timer so that you lay down the color and you walk away and leave it. So I'm going to go ahead and load my brush 50-50, so it's pretty watery here. Tap, tap, tap. And let's go in holding, see, it doesn't come natural for me to hold my brush back, but it's a great practice in loosening up and kind of relinquishing that control. So I'm just going to go in and create these flowers. Point, press, but now I'm really letting my brush dance around, wiggling, and just creating these really nice flow. So I just leave it now. Just leave it alone, walk away, and then we'll come back and let our brush dance around a little bit more. You can even do that right now. But look at these fun brush strokes. So I pulled up a little bit darker value, and look at that, just letting the brush dance around your paper. And then let's leave that and we'll come back. I will go ahead and put in our stem. Again, I want it to bleed and blend with my flower because that just helps with creating that nice washy, loose effect. And that's probably about 3 minutes on that flower. So that's the second way, backing up on your brush and letting your brush dance around. The last way here, and by the way, I really focus on shapes. The way I paint is more simplistic. I love to just have fun, relax, nice and washy. But for me to do that, I try to figure out what is kind of identifiable in a flower and just focus on those shapes. So I'm suggesting petals and leaves with simple organic shapes. I'm letting the edges soften and bleed into one another. I'm not stressing about the perfection because florals are about, for me, the impression they leave on somebody, not so much that they're perfect or the precision in it. Also, when you go, we're going to go back into these. When you have a really loose, watery piece, it's great. For me, I do like to have just little touches of detail, but very light, a very light touch with details. Like some of the stamens or the fine lines, and I use them last, and I use them really sparingly because a little detail goes a long way. I do my best to just let that softness and that kind of ethereal feel, just really be the star here. Let's go on to our third flower here. So color bleeds. Bleeding in, that wet on wet is really, for me, identifiable with a soft, loose feel. Let's go ahead and I'm gonna go in with, you can use either one of these techniques to start. So I'm gonna pick up some of that purple, which is pretty strong here, but I'm tapping off my brush, maybe add just a little bit more water, tapping off my brush, and now I'm gonna go in and create those petals again. I've got 5 petals. I'm gonna use as few brush strokes as possible, and let's just go in and lay down our base. Here, I added a little bit more water, kind of doing a version of both of those. I'm also a really great tip for creating that softness is use your water as a color. So right here, I've got these dark colors. Let me darken them up because I really want to get a bleed here. So I'm going into my purple and just picking up more. Now for the last petal, I'm washing and rinsing my brush, tapping it off, and I'm gonna go in with just water. I'm treating it as a color, and look at how beautiful this will be. Just like that. So I used the water as a color, and then it kind of grabbed the colors around it. Now let's go into our green. We want that bleed. Point press. Point press, point press, just like that. Now, while that is still wet, I'm gonna go in, actually, let me darken this up so you can see it. Point press, point press. Now, I'm gonna create another leaf underneath it, but just using a damp wet brush. So let's do one right here, point press. And look at the color bleed there. Let me do that one more time in case that's not showing up real well. Point press, and look at the beautiful bleed. So that is done with just water. And that also creates. Now for that bleed, we can use a little bit of our pink in there while this is still wet. And I'm gonna use a whole brush stroke. You wanna make sure too, you're working damp and damp, not too wet and puddly. So one brush stroke here, point press, like that, point press, point press, just like that, and you get this beautiful bleed. So that is another way. Now let's go back to this one that we used water first, and with my really flowy, light paintings, I do like to add in a tiny bit of detail. So I'm gonna go in and just in the middle here, I'm gonna pick up some of my Payne's Gray because it has that blue in it that I love. And I'm just gonna go into the center here and tap in. Because when you have a really, really loose flower, you want to make sure there is a little bit of detail. You need a little bit of grounding. So I'm adding in little dots. I could add those in here as well, just to kind of feel like your painting does have a little bit of clarity, right? And then for the leaves, I will go in with my, I could have used purple or green. I'm going to use my olive green and then maybe just a tad of purple to bring some coherence. And I'm going to go in, tap, 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 tap my brush, and just a few, just a tiny few brush strokes. Point, press, like that. So I've got a very loose and washy painting, but I am going in and adding in just a little bit of detail. Point, press, just like that. And that's it. That's all the detail this needs. And then with this one, I went in and I just added in a few little dots. We could add in something like that. So you're giving it just enough detail, but look at these fun edges you have. You could even do this with the leaves. So I'm gonna hold my brush back a little farther, let my brush kind of dance around like that, and you get this really fun edge, but yet it's loose. Now, our last one with the color bleeds, look at the beautiful color bleeds we've got down here and right here. Now, this is still a little bit wet, but I'm gonna go ahead and go in there with my Payne's Gray Black. Let's see here. And I'm just gonna touch into the very middle. Now, because this isn't completely wet, it's really gonna spread. So just one little dot here. Just like that. Isn't that pretty? And I love this washiness. Now, I was saying to think of water as a color. So you could, if you were doing a bouquet, you could go in next to this and add in some petals, maybe sticking out in the back. So just a wet brush. Another wet brush here. And creating a little petal in the back, uneven edges. Maybe we want to go in here and create a leaf. So I just pick up a tiny bit of my green and maybe have, let's see, where could we put a leaf? Maybe one coming out right here, or a stem even, like that. But touching in. So using water, again, as a color, I think is really a great technique. And can just be really pretty. So I'm grabbing the paint from this flower and adding on some pretty little florals in the background. Just adding in a tiny bit of color, barely any. But I just love doing that. I love using water as a color. All right, well, I hope that helps. I hope it gave you just a few things to play with. So water first, and then going back in and to get that little bit of grounding and detail, wait for it to dry and go in with a tiny bit of detail. Less is more. And then this one is just backing up on your brush and letting your paintbrush kind of dance around for some of those little details, especially with these little leaves. And then color bleeds, making sure damp in damp. And you're letting some of the colors bleed. I'm also using water as a color here. And you can do that with the leaves, which is really, really pretty. I love touching into a neighboring petal or leaf and letting it spread. And then again, just ending with a little bit of detail in there. So grab your brush, you know, maybe choose 3 little flowers that you'd like to do, set a 10-minute timer, and just paint those loose flowers without creating too much overthinking, just going with the flow. It's all about that feeling. It's all about not being perfect with your petals, letting your brush dance around, letting the colors bloom, and really, most importantly, like I always say, just enjoying this beautiful medium, enjoying this moment that you're in right now. So let me know what tip seem to resonate with you, what's kind of your style, and happy painting. All right, everybody.